My husband had been gone for 3 years. 3 years of a silence so profound I could hear the dust settling on his favorite armchair. The house, our house for 42 years, had become an echo chamber of memory, every creak of the floorboard a ghost of a step, every rustle of the curtains a whisper of his voice. I thought that grief was the hardest season I would ever have to weather. I was wrong. The real storm came not from his absence, but from the people who were supposed to uphold his memory. His family, the Clarks, had never truly considered me one of their own. I was always Arthur's wife, the quiet woman from the other side of the tracks who had stolen their golden boy's heart. After the funeral, the politeness that had held us together for decades began to fray, thread by thread. It started with small things. A comment about the house being too much for me. A suggestion that I might be happier in a little apartment. Then came the letters from their lawyer. Arthur, in his boundless trust and love, had left everything to me, his dearest Margaret. The Clarks contested the will. They claimed he'd promised them the family heirlooms, the property, that he'd been confused in his final days. It was a brutal, grinding legal battle that drained my savings and my spirit. I fought them for 2 years, not for the money, but for Arthur. For our life together. For the home we'd built. But in the end, the weight of their money and their malice was too much. I lost. The judge's gavel felt like a physical blow, severing me not just from the house, but from the last tangible piece of my life with Arthur. They gave me 30 days to leave. On the final day, I packed a single, worn-out suitcase with my clothes, a few photographs, and Arthur's old, dog-eared copy of Leaves of Grass. Everything else was just furniture. It was the memories that were being evicted. And so, I found myself standing under the flickering, sickly yellow light of the bus station in a small, rain-swept city in Ohio. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and damp concrete. It was a Tuesday, I think. The days had started to blur into one long, gray smear. I was 68 years old, alone in the world, with a suitcase that held the sum total of my existence and a bank account that was as close to empty as made no difference. The ticket in my hand was for a town I'd never heard of, a place I'd chosen from a map because it was far away and the rent was cheap. It was a one-way journey into a future I couldn't imagine and didn't particularly want. The bench was cold, hard plastic, and a fine mist from the open doorway settled on my coat like a shroud. I clutched the suitcase handle until my knuckles turned white, trying to anchor myself against the tide of despair that threatened to pull me under. I watched people come and go, young couples laughing, students with backpacks, businessmen barking into phones. They all had places to be, people waiting for them. I was a ghost in my own life, a spectator to a world that had moved on without me. The noise of the station was a dull roar, but inside my head, there was only a deafening silence. This was rock bottom. This was the moment where the story was supposed to end. But as I would soon learn, sometimes the most important stories begin at the very moment you think they are finished. The loudspeaker crackled, announcing a delay for my bus. Another hour. An eternity. I felt the hot prick of tears behind my eyes, and I shut them tightly, refusing to let them fall in this public, unforgiving place. I would not give the Clarks the satisfaction, even in my own mind, of seeing me break. I focused on my breathing, on the weight of the suitcase against my leg, on the photograph of Arthur tucked inside my purse. His smiling face, forever 55. I must have been sitting like that for some time, lost in the bleak landscape of my own thoughts, when a voice, young and tentative, cut through the fog. "Excuse me, ma'am?" I opened my eyes. Standing before me was a young woman, couldn't have been more than 20. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her head, her thin jacket soaked through. She was shivering, clutching a small, battered backpack to her chest. Her eyes were wide, full of a fear I recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who had nowhere left to go. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice trembling from the cold. "But is this seat taken?" I gestured weakly to the empty space beside me. "It's all yours." She sat down with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. She smelled of rain and cheap perfume. We sat in silence for a few minutes, two strangers adrift in the same sea of uncertainty. I could feel her glancing at me, as if trying to summon the courage to speak again. "Rough night?" I finally asked, the words feeling rusty and unfamiliar in my mouth. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "You could say that. The kind of night that makes you wonder if the universe has it in for you." I nodded slowly. I'm familiar with the feeling. Her name was Chloe, she told me. She was from a little town upstate and had come to the city with a boyfriend who had promised her the world. Turns out, the world he'd promised involved a lot of waiting tables while he played video games and a shared studio apartment that felt smaller and smaller with every passing day. Tonight, they'd had the final blow-up. He'd told her to get out. She had $40 to her name and a bus ticket home, a ticket she was deeply ashamed to use. "I can't go back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Everyone told me not to go with him. My mom, my dad, they said he was no good. I was so sure they were wrong. I was so sure I knew better. Now I have to go back with my tail between my legs and admit they were right. It feels like failing at being a person." I listened to her, this young girl with her whole life ahead of her, talking about failure. And something inside me, a part one thought had been permanently numbed by grief and betrayal, began to stir. It was a flicker of empathy, a tiny, defiant spark. "Failure," I said, my voice soft, "is sometimes just a detour you didn't plan on taking. It doesn't mean you're lost forever. It just means you need a new map." She looked at me then, really looked at me, her eyes searching my face. "What's your detour?" she asked. And so I told her. I told her about Arthur. About the 42 years of love and laundry, of shared jokes and quiet mornings. I told her about the cancer, the long, slow goodbye that still didn't feel long enough. And then, my voice barely more than a whisper, I told her about the Clarks. About the legal papers, the coldness in their eyes, the finality of losing my home. I told her about the suitcase and the one-way ticket to nowhere. By the time I finished, the tears were streaming down my face freely, and I didn't try to stop them. Chloe was crying too. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and placed her hand on top of mine. Her hand was ice cold, but the gesture was warmer than any I had felt in years. In that moment, under the flickering lights of that grim bus station, a connection was forged. It wasn't a grand, dramatic thing. It was quiet, fragile, born from shared vulnerability. She was at the beginning of her adult life, scared and defeated. I was nearing the end of what I thought was mine, scared and defeated in a different way. We were 2 generations apart, yet sitting on that cold plastic bench, we were exactly the same. The loudspeaker announced the final boarding for my bus. The sound was like an alarm clock dragging me from a fragile dream. I wiped my eyes with a tissue from my purse, my hands shaking. I had to go. This strange, fleeting moment of communion was over. I stood up, my joints protesting. Chloe looked up at me, her face a mask of fresh anxiety. The reality of her own situation was crashing back down. "Well," I said, my voice hoarse. "Good luck, Chloe. I hope you find your way." I turned to walk towards the gate, the weight of my suitcase feeling heavier than ever. Each step was an effort. I was walking back into the loneliness, back into the abyss. I could hear the bus engine rumbling, a beast waiting to carry me away into the unknown. "Wait." Her voice was sharp, desperate. I stopped and turned back. She was on her feet, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She took a hesitant step towards me. Where is your bus going?" she asked. I told her the name of the small town, a place that meant nothing to either of us. She bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting mine again. There was a new determination in her eyes, a flicker of the person she was before the world had knocked her down. "My bus home. It doesn't leave for another 3 hours," she said. Then she took a deep, shaky breath. Would you mind if I came with you? Just for a little while. Just until I figure out what to do. I can't sit here alone for 3 hours. The request was so unexpected, so utterly illogical, that I was struck dumb. A young girl, wanting to follow a sad, old stranger to a town she'd never heard of? It was foolish. It was reckless. Every sensible bone in my 68-year-old body told me to say no, to wish her well and get on my bus. but I looked into her eyes, and I didn't see a threat. I saw a reflection of my own profound loneliness. I saw the same desperate need for an anchor, for a single, kind face in a cold world. Arthur had always said my greatest weakness and my greatest strength was my heart. He said I collected strays, wounded birds, lonely neighbors, friends down on their luck. Maybe, even now, he was guiding me. The bus driver called out a final warning. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was a crossroads, a decision that felt far bigger than it should have. "It's a one-way ticket," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what's there. I don't even know where I'll be sleeping tomorrow." Chloe shouldered her backpack. A single, determined nod. "Neither do I." And so, in an act of pure, unscripted faith, I bought a second one-way ticket. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't just buying a ticket for a bus. I was buying a ticket for a second chance. For both of us. As the bus pulled out of the station, leaving the grim yellow lights behind, I looked at the young woman asleep in the seat beside me, her head resting against the window, and for the first time in 3 long years, the heavy silence in my head was filled not with grief, but with the soft, rhythmic sound of someone else breathing. The bus groaned and hissed its way through the night, a lumbering metal whale navigating a sea of darkened highways and sleeping towns. The world outside was a void of black, punctuated only by the occasional lonely farmhouse light or the blur of an oncoming car. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Most of the passengers were dozing, their heads lolling against the seats. But I was wide awake, gripped by a surreal, trembling awareness. What had I done? The question echoed in my mind, each repetition laced with a fresh spike of anxiety. I, Margaret Thompson, a woman who planned her weekly meals every Sunday and who still balanced her checkbook by hand, had just invited a complete stranger, a young girl I'd met in a bus station, to follow me into the complete unknown. It was the most impulsive, the most reckless thing I had done in my entire life. Arthur would have been speechless. The Clarks would have cited it as further proof of my unsound mind. Maybe they were right. Perhaps grief had finally eroded my sanity. I glanced over at Chloe. She had fallen asleep almost as soon as the bus had found its rhythm, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. In sleep, she looked even younger. The weary tension had melted from her face, revealing a softness, a vulnerability that tugged at my heart. She was just a child, really. Someone's daughter. And she was trusting me, a frail-looking old woman with a suitcase full of ghosts. The weight of that trust felt immense, a responsibility I hadn't asked for and wasn't sure I could bear. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. The town was called Cedar Fork. I'd found it in a classified ad for a small, furnished studio, reasonable rent, utilities included. I had a single, grainy photograph printed from the library's computer and a phone number. That was it. That was the sum total of my planning. What if it was a scam? What if the place was a hovel? What if the landlord took one look at the two of us, a pensioner and a bedraggled youth, and turned us away? And what about Chloe? What was I going to do with her? She couldn't stay with me. The ad was for a studio, 1 room. It was barely big enough for 1 person, let alone 2. This was a temporary madness, a single night's strange alliance. In the cold light of day, we would have to part ways. She would have to face her family, and I would have to face my new, solitary life. The thought sent a fresh wave of loneliness through me, so potent it was a physical ache. The bus hit a pothole, jolting us. Chloe stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, before settling back into her slumber. She had wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. Without thinking, I carefully unfolded the thin, woolen blanket I had packed in my suitcase, Arthur's blanket, the one he always used for his naps, and draped it over her shoulders. She sighed, a contented little sound, and snuggled into its warmth. The gesture, small and maternal, unlocked a flood of memories. I remembered tucking our daughter, Sarah, into bed when she was small. The same careful arrangement of blankets, the same quiet sigh of contentment. Sarah was grown now, living across the country in Seattle, with a life and a family of her own. We talked every Sunday, but the distance, both geographical and experiential, was vast. She had her own struggles, her own children to raise. I had never told her the full extent of the battle with the Clarks, not wanting to burden her. I had put on a brave face, assuring her I was managing, that the lawyers were handling it. The shame of my defeat was now another layer of isolation. As the miles ticked by, the initial panic began to subside, replaced by a weary resignation. What was done was done. I had made a choice, an irrational one, but it was made. For tonight, at least, I was not alone. And that, in itself, was a strange and powerful comfort. The sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep, bruised purple when the bus driver's voice crackled over the intercom. Cedar Fork, next stop. 20 minutes. My heart leapt into my throat. This was it. I gently shook Chloe's shoulder. We're almost there. She awoke with a start, confusion clouding her eyes for a moment before recognition dawned. She looked out the window at the passing landscape, which was slowly revealing itself in the dawn's early light. It was rolling countryside, dotted with patches of pine forest and the occasional field, all shrouded in a low-lying morning mist. It was peaceful, but to my anxious eyes, it looked desolate. "Wow," she said, her voice raspy with sleep. "It's quiet." That was the idea, I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The bus pulled into a stop that was little more than a covered bench on the side of a two-lane highway. The driver unloaded our bags, my worn suitcase and her small backpack, from the undercarriage with a grunt. "You ladies have a good day now," he said, before climbing back into his seat and closing the doors with a hiss. The bus pulled away, its rumble fading quickly, leaving us standing in a silence that was absolute and profound. We were alone. The chill morning air bit through my coat. I looked around. There was the bus stop, a small, shingled shelter with a faded map behind plexiglass. Across the road was a gas station, its lights just flickering on. 100 yards down the road, I could see a cluster of buildings that presumably constituted the town proper. It was small. So, Chloe said, hugging herself against the cold. "What's the plan, Stan?" The absurdity of the nickname, so casual and youthful, almost made me smile. "The plan," I said, pulling the folded ad from my purse, "is to find this address. And hope it exists." We started walking towards the town, the wheels of my suitcase clacking noisily on the pavement, the only sound in the still morning. Cedar Fork was postcard pretty in a sleepy, forgotten kind of way. A main street with a handful of shops, a hardware store, a diner with a glowing open sign, a post office, and a small grocery. Everything was clean and well kept, but it had an air of stillness, of a place that hadn't changed in 50 years. The address led us to a side street, to a 2-story white clapboard house with a wide porch. A sign in the front yard read Miller's Rooms. This was it. My stomach was a tight knot of nerves. I climbed the porch steps, my legs feeling like lead, with Chloe hovering a few steps behind me. I rang the bell. A moment later, the door was opened by a man who looked to be in his late 70s, with a kind, wrinkled face and a head of thick white hair. He was wearing a cardigan and holding a mug of coffee. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice friendly but curious. "I'm Margaret Thompson," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I called about the studio for rent?" Recognition dawned on his face. Yes. Mrs. Thompson. From Ohio. You made good time." His eyes flickered past me to Chloe. "And this was the moment. I could say she was my granddaughter, visiting. I could tell the truth and risk his suspicion." I took a breath. "This is Chloe. She's traveling with me." He looked between us, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Well, come on in, both of you. The place is all ready. I'm Walter Miller. My wife, Agnes, and I own this place." He led us through the house, which was cozy and smelled of lemon polish and baking, to a door at the back that opened onto a small, self-contained studio apartment. It was one room, with a tiny kitchenette along one wall, a sitting area, and a bed in the corner. A door led to a small bathroom. It was simple, clean, and flooded with morning light. It was perfect. "It's not much," Walter said, "but it's clean and it's warm. Rent's due on the 1st. Utilities are included." I felt a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. "It's lovely," I whispered. We handled the paperwork at his kitchen table, Agnes, a plump woman with a warm smile, pressing cups of hot tea and warm cinnamon rolls into our hands. It was a kindness I felt deep in my soul. When Walter handed me the key, it felt like I was being handed the key to a new life, or at least, a temporary shelter from the storm. Back in the studio, the reality of the situation settled upon us once more. Chloe looked around the single room, at the one bed. "I'll take the floor," she said immediately. "Or the couch." "Seriously, it's fine." "Don't be ridiculous," I said, though the same thought had been screaming in my head. "We'll figure it out." We unpacked our meager belongings. My few clothes in the dresser, Arthur's book on the nightstand. Her few things took up a single drawer. The space was suddenly, intimately shared. The silence between us was awkward, filled with the unspoken question of what now? It was Chloe who broke it. I should probably try to call my parents. Let them know I'm okay. I nodded. "There's a phone at the main house. Walter said we could use it." She looked terrified. "Yeah, okay." She didn't move. "Would you like me to come with you?" I asked, the offer surprising even me. Her eyes met mine, filled with gratitude. "Would you?" And so, I found myself standing next to her in Walter's hallway as she dialed the number with a shaking finger. I heard the faint ring on the other end, then a woman's voice, sharp with worry. "Hello. Mom?" Chloe's voice was a tiny, broken thing. "It's me." The conversation that followed was a torrent of emotion I could only hear one side of. Tears streamed down Chloe's face. "I know. I'm so sorry. I was so stupid. I'm in a place called Cedar Fork." "No, with a friend." She looked at me. "Her name is Margaret. She's been kind to me." She listened for a long time, then said, "I love you too, Mom. I'll come home soon. I promise." She hung up the phone and slumped against the wall, sobbing with a relief that was painful to witness. I put a tentative arm around her shoulders, and she turned and buried her face in my shoulder, her whole body shaking. I held her, this stranger's child, and felt the ghost of my own daughter in my arms. I was comforting her, but in some profound way, she was comforting me. The simple, human act of holding and being held was a balm on wounds I had thought were untreatable. We walked back to the studio in the bright morning sun. The world looked different. The colors seemed sharper, the air sweeter. We were still two lost souls, with uncertain futures. But we were no longer two separate islands of despair. We were an archipelago, connected by a fragile, newfound bridge. We had survived the night. And for now, in this quiet little town, with a roof over our heads and a strange, tentative companionship between us that felt like a victory. The struggle was far from over, but the crushing weight of absolute loneliness had lifted. We had found a harbor, however temporary. And sometimes, a harbor is all you need to keep from sinking. The first week in Cedar Fork passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. It was a period of adjustment, of two people from different worlds learning to orbit each other in a single, small room. There was an unspoken agreement between us, a temporary truce. We would stay together until Chloe felt strong enough to face her family, until I felt stable enough to be on my own. It was a practical arrangement, but with each passing day, it became something more. We fell into a routine. Mornings were mine. I would wake early, as I always had, and make a pot of tea on the little stove. I'd sit in the armchair by the window and watch the town come to life, Arthur's copy of Leaves of Grass open, but unread on my lap. The quiet was no longer menacing, it was peaceful. Chloe would sleep late, the deep, recuperative sleep of the young and exhausted. When she finally stirred, I would have toast and jam waiting for her. Afternoons were for exploration. We would walk into town, our footsteps syncopated on the pavement. We became familiar faces at the diner, where a waitress named Brenda always had a warm smile and a bottomless coffee pot. We browsed the sparse shelves of the grocery store, planning simple, cheap meals we could cook together on the two-burner stove. We walked along the creek that gave the town its name, the water babbling over smooth stones, a constant, soothing soundtrack. It was on one of these walks, about 10 days after we'd arrived, that the fragile bubble of our temporary life was punctured. We were passing the post office, and I decided to check the mailbox I'd rented. Among the flyers for local services was a single, formal-looking envelope. My blood ran cold. I recognized the law firm's logo in the return address. It was from the Clark's lawyers. My hands trembled as I tore it open. It was a final notice regarding the storage unit where I had placed the few remaining items from the house: my grandmother's china, a box of Sarah's childhood drawings, Arthur's vinyl record collection. The Clarks were disputing the ownership of the contents. They were demanding an inventory and threatening further legal action if I did not comply. They weren't just content with taking my home. They wanted to erase every last trace of me, to pick over the bones of my life with Arthur until there was nothing left. The pain was a fresh, sharp wound. I stumbled to a nearby bench, the world swimming before my eyes. I thought I had hit bottom in that bus station, but this was a new depth. This was cruelty for cruelty's sake. Chloe sat beside me, her face etched with concern. "Margaret? What is it? What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I just handed her the letter. She read it, her brow furrowing in confusion and then anger. "They can't do this. This is insane. It's a box of old records and dishes. What is wrong with these people?" Her outrage, so fierce and immediate, was like a lifeline. She wasn't just offering polite sympathy. She was genuinely, passionately indignant on my behalf. "They hate me," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "They always have. I was never good enough for their Arthur. And now that he's gone, they want to make sure I disappear." "Well, they can't," Chloe said, her voice firm. She folded the letter with sharp, decisive movements and shoved it into her pocket. "We are not going to let them." "We." I looked at her, my vision blurred by tears. "Yes, we," she said, taking my hand. Her grip was strong. "You stood by me when I had to make the hardest phone call of my life. You gave me a safe place to land. Let me stand by you now. We'll fight this." And so we did. In our own small way, we fought back. That afternoon, we went back to the studio, and Chloe, who was far more adept with technology than I, helped me draft a letter. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was from me. I told them, in clear, unemotional language, that the items in the storage unit were my personal property, remnants of a life lived long before Arthur, or gifts given solely to me. I stated that I would be providing a full inventory, not for their approval, but for the record. And I ended it with a sentence that Chloe insisted upon: "Your efforts to diminish my husband's memory through these actions are noted, and they are a profound disappointment to the man he was." Sending that letter felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. It was a small act of defiance, but it was mine. And I hadn't done it alone. In the days that followed, the dynamic between Chloe and me began to shift. The generational gap, so vast at first, started to feel like a bridge rather than a chasm. She taught me how to use the library's computer to video call my daughter, Sarah. Seeing Sarah's face, seeing my grandchildren wave and blow kisses from 2,000 miles away, filled a hollow space inside me I had long ignored. I had been so determined to be strong for them, to not be a burden, that I had forgotten they wanted to be there for me. Sarah cried when I finally told her the whole story about the Clarks and losing the house. "Oh, Mom," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion. "You should have told me. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." In turn, I listened to Chloe. Really listened. She told me about her dreams of becoming a graphic designer, dreams she'd put on hold for a boyfriend who had mocked them. She showed me her drawings on a sketch pad she pulled from the bottom of her backpack. They were vibrant, full of life and a quirky, unique style. The talent was undeniable, but her belief in it was shattered. He said it was a silly hobby, she confessed one evening, her voice small. That I'd never make any money at it. "Arthur was an accountant," I said softly, looking out the window. But his passion was his garden. He could spend hours out there, talking to his roses. People thought it was eccentric, but it brought him joy. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your joy is silly, Chloe. The world has enough accountants. It never has enough beauty. She was quiet for a long time after that. The turning point, the moment our temporary truce solidified into a genuine, lasting bond, came on a rainy Thursday. We had been in Cedar Fork for 3 weeks. Chloe had been quiet all day, withdrawn. I knew she was thinking about home, about the future. The temporary reprieve was ending. Reality was calling. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, she broke the silence. "I talked to my dad today," she said, her back to me as she folded a sweater. "He bought me a bus ticket. It leaves the day after tomorrow." The words hung in the air, final and heavy. I had known this was coming, but the news still felt like a physical blow. The studio, which had begun to feel cozy and lived in, suddenly felt vast and empty again. "I see," I said, my voice carefully neutral. That's good. I'm glad." She turned around, and I saw that her eyes were filled with tears. "I don't want to go," she whispered. The confession shocked me. "But your family. They love you. They're waiting for you." "I know," she said, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "And I miss them. I really do. But going back feels like going backwards. Like admitting that the person I was trying to become doesn't exist. Here with you. I feel like I'm someone else. Someone stronger." I understood completely. Here, away from the ghosts of my old life and the venom of the Clarks, I was becoming someone else, too. Someone who wasn't just Arthur's widow, a victim of circumstance. I was Margaret, the woman who bought a stranger a bus ticket, who stood up to bullies, who shared her small space and her smaller pension with a lost girl. "You are strong, Chloe," I said, my own eyes welling up. "You had the courage to leave a bad situation. You had the humility to accept help. And you have the strength to go home and face the music, not as a failure, but as someone who learned a hard lesson and lived to tell the tale. That takes a fortitude that many people never find." We stayed up most of that night, talking not as an old woman and a young girl, but as two friends. We talked about love and loss, about dreams and disappointments. We laughed about the time we tried to make a pizza from scratch and ended up with a doughy disaster. We cried about the people we missed and the futures we feared. We bared our souls in that little studio, and in doing so, we knit them together. The next day, we didn't talk about her leaving. Instead, we went into town and, using the last of my carefully budgeted funds, we bought art supplies. A proper sketchbook, a set of good pencils, some watercolor paints. It was my parting gift to her. "Don't let it become a silly hobby," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "Let it be your garden." The morning of her departure was bright and clear. Walter drove us to the bus stop in his old pickup truck. The scene was a mirror of our arrival, but the feeling was entirely different. We were not two lost souls anymore. We were two people who had found each other at the exact moment they needed to. As the bus pulled into view, Chloe turned to me, her eyes streaming. "I don't know how to thank you, Margaret. You saved me." I pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if she were my own. "No, my dear," I whispered into her hair. "You saved me." She climbed onto the bus, found a window seat, and pressed her hand against the glass. I waved until the bus disappeared around a bend in the road, taking a piece of my newly mended heart with it. I stood there for a long time, alone once more. But the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the echo of her laughter, the memory of her fierce loyalty, the certainty of her friendship. The Clarks could have the house. They could have the heirlooms. They could have all of it. They had taken my past, but they couldn't touch my future. I walked back to the studio, my steps slow but steady. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was tidy, her side of the dresser empty. But on the small table, she had left her final gift to me. It was a drawing, beautifully rendered in pencil. It was a portrait of me, sitting in the armchair by the window, a soft smile on my face, a look of peace in my eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Underneath, she had written, "For Margaret, who taught me that the most important journeys aren't about the distance you travel, but the people you meet along the way. With all my love, Chloe." I framed the drawing in a simple frame from the hardware store and placed it on the nightstand, right next to Arthur's book. I looked from his smiling photograph to the portrait of the woman I was becoming. The grief was still there, a familiar ache. The struggle wasn't over. But I was no longer just a widow, no longer just a victim. I was a friend. I was a survivor. And as I looked out the window at the quiet, steadfast beauty of Cedar Fork, I knew, for the first time in a very long time, that I was going to be okay. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning again.